All right, I wrote 2 scripts for this video, but I didn't like either one. So I'm going to do an old-fashioned unscripted video. Hopefully it doesn't get too long and rambly. I will try to cut it down if it does. And hopefully it'll make some sense. But anyway, there is this big drama about Laci Green. If you don't know who Laci Green is, I don't know why you know who the fuck I am and are watching my channel. Way more popular than me. But on Laci Green's channel, she's a popular feminist who made these videos. 2 of them now. Her first video got so much shit. I think she made the second one to respond to that, where she says she's reaching out to anti-feminists to find out what they think. Now, I assume that she's doing this because when you're a young person, or any person, there comes a point where you wonder about the things you believe, whether you believe them because they're true or because you have a vested interest in believing them, whether you are indoctrinated into believing them. Anyone who's a thoughtful person has these moments where they reevaluate. So she probably made this video and she's like, yeah, I'm going through this reevaluation of values thing, to use a Nietzschean term. And, I'm going to be doing this for a while. And she was probably completely shocked to get a backlash to it, because it's a normal thing that a normal person would do, just like most people aren't on YouTube. So to her, she's like, what? Like, if you told your friends you were doing something like this, they might have some concerns about it in real life, but most of your friends wouldn't have the kind of reaction that people on YouTube have. That's where I'm coming from with this. Now, I'm not on YouTube that much. I have a life now, so I don't spend a lot of time on YouTube. But somebody mentioned to me that Captain Andy's video about Laci Green really broke out. It was like a breakout video for Captain Andy. He got a lot of views. And I was like, well, what did he make a video about Laci Green about? Which is where I first heard of this. So I go and I watch Captain Andy's video, and I found it awful. Even by Captain Andy's standards. I'm not sure how long I made into it, but in the beginning he's criticizing her, and even in the title, by calling her a liberal. Now, the term liberal, when we talk about liberal values, basically we're all liberals now. Even the most conservative person has some liberal values. Things like democracy and free speech. So when he says, well, Laci Green, she's a liberal, what I would mean if I criticize somebody for being a liberal would be about the kind of rift between who we call liberals on the left and radicals. So when I call someone a liberal, what I'm saying is, oh, those liberals, they're so milquetoast and bourgeois, and if something affects them personally, they're suddenly very conservative. That would be what my criticism is. Captain Andy's criticism of her seems to be she believes too much in a democratic society and free speech. A society that mulls over ideas, even if they're unpopular, and has actual intellectual discussion. Because when you compare me and Captain Andy, I'm a old school early 20th century, Upton Sinclair style populist socialist. That's my politics. He is more like Stalin. Perhaps it's unfair. Castro on a good day. That's more Captain Andy's politics. Free speech, when conservatives are saying liberals are attacking free speech, this is not a completely made up complaint. Because there's a lot of people like Captain Andy out there. But this is not a shit talking video about Captain Andy. But the idea that the left attacking free speech is something the right has completely made up, that's not true. It's just exaggerated, as the right exaggerates things and distorts them to fit their narrative, just as the left sometimes exaggerates things and distorts them to fit theirs in the media. So I think there really are people on the left who, like, they don't like free speech. You know, in the United States, we have like no real distinction between free speech and hate speech, where a lot of European countries do. That is a debatable subject, but I think it goes beyond that with a lot of people on the left, quite frankly. But that's, once again, not what this video is about. As far as the Laci Green thing, after watching her videos, after Captain Annie's video, and wanting to know what someone who's not an idiot thought about it, I came across Chrisiousity video, who I consider not an idiot. And I figured she would give me more of an idea of what would be on the pulse of what people are thinking on YouTube. So, I watched her video and didn't make it through it either. I got about halfway through. And the reason that I couldn't get more than halfway through is the first half of the video, she is just talking about how Laci is acting irrational. And she, as the third-party objective observer, is going to critique Laci about how she's not being logically consistent. Now, the problem with this, I don't see a problem with critiquing someone's position for logical consistency, their political views, and you say, well, does this view hold up to scrutiny? Logical consistency would be one of the things. Doing that for someone's behavior is just odd. And it's done on YouTube all the time, because behavior is not logical. Like, when you fall in love with somebody, which I assume Laci feels she has, because who she's dating is a big part of this controversy, you aren't logical. So if you're going to critique somebody by who they're dating and who they're socializing with for logical consistency, what you're really doing is you're trying to control them and saying that they need to behave by your standards, because you are the logical third-party arbiter of what is correct behavior. This used to bother me on YouTube before, but now it bothers me more. I would now describe myself as an anti-rationalist, which I tended to reject rationalist critiques of religion previously, and I had some anti-rationalist leanings if you watched my last channel. But for the most part, my views really still relied on a post-Kantian idea of rationality and science, even though it was much more nuanced than the new atheists and a lot of these people on YouTube. We had more in common than we had differences. It's just I was really criticizing the lack of nuance. Now I've reached a point where I think you are in error when you use the idea of rationality to examine human behavior and human beliefs. And I already recorded a video where I'm going to explain this in more detail. But that's the problem I have with the way Chrisiousity is approaching this material. But she's approaching it the same way everyone on YouTube does. Everyone approaches everything on YouTube, and we're never talking about ideas or philosophical discussions. What we're talking about is somebody's behavior, some drama, and everyone approaches it as if they are an objective third-party observer who is the pinnacle of rationality, and they are going to tell you why this person is not being rational. That is a thing that Chrisiousity criticizes the anti-fems for, and she's right. They act that way. Just when she acts that way and her side acts that way, like most of us, she's blind to it. it's very easy to see the biases in other people. It is much harder to see it in yourself. And a lot of people on YouTube act like they are above bias. But once again, these are topics that I'm going to broach in my next 3 videos after this. Now, one of the things that she brings up is like Kevin Logan tried to contact Laci Green, and Laci apparently did not talk to him because Shuan Head told her about some of the things Kevin Logan had said about her. Once again, whether this is right or wrong, whether Kevin Logan is worse or better than the people Laci Green is hanging out with is not for me to decide. It's not for Chrisiousity to decide. It's for Laci Green to decide. Now, Chrisiousity makes the evaluation that Kevin Logan is not as bad in her rational, objective opinion as these people that Laci Green is talking to. A lot of these people Laci Green is talking to, I have never heard of. So I can't even compare them to Kevin Logan. But the thing with Kevin Logan is his actual transgression is a good example of what exactly is wrong with this whole Laci Green thing. His transgression was he made a video where he was addressing Shuan Head directly and said that Armored Skeptic thinks of her as just a cum bucket because he, of course, knows Armored Skeptic better than her, who is dating him, and is, the third-party objective arbiter of who she should date and who's a good guy and who would be good for her. Now, this is totally immaterial to whether he is good for her. Like, that's not for us to decide discussing on the internet. Now, the thing that Kevin Logan apologized for is he called her a cum bucket, basically. And, he's like, well, I wasn't saying she was a cum bucket. I was saying the Armored Skeptic thinks of her as a cum bucket. And, that's not the transgression to me. The transgression is this is a man who consistently, even after he apologized for this, where he used the wrong words, but Kevin Logan repeatedly does this to women. And that is my problem with male feminists in general, because I don't think men can be feminists. In fact, when someone would say to me, "You're my favorite feminist channel," I wouldn't tell them men can't be feminists, but what I would say to them is, why isn't your favorite feminist channel a woman? So Kevin Logan, basically denied Shuan Head's autonomy, which is the problem. Anti-fems get this, by the way. They exaggerate it, and they have a very libertarian idea about freedom. So I use the word autonomy because I lean toward a more Rousseauian or Kantian idea about it. But they're not wrong. They're not wrong that the left and feminists to other feminists who they disagree with and male feminists consistently deny the autonomy of other women when they don't conform to their politics. That's what's happening to Laci Green right now. Because she wants to date a person she actually wants to date. She wants to control her own social interactions and not have to have them dictated by the mob of YouTube, who is just her audience. Now, I would have sympathy for these arguments if I saw any actual concern for Laci. Because here's the thing, what are you afraid of? You're afraid of hanging out with these people? If she's dating a non-feminist, something bad's going to happen to her? So here's where I see the hypocrisy lies with this. Is this so-called social justice community, as Chrisiousity calls it, is basically an almost like orthodox religion, in that if you have the correct belief, you're in. If you don't have the correct belief, you're out. What happened to me on YouTube was when I started talking about feminism, I got kind of just dragged into it. And then I made a long series about feminism, and I was like, then I'm done. And then people just kept insisting I make videos about feminism. They kept insisting that I respond to this person, respond to this person, respond to this person. It just kept going. I did not like this because I don't think men should be leading the conversation about feminism. And when I was doing this, there were lots of women who were feminists who did have channels who I wanted to support because I want them to be the people listen to. Here's the problem with that. It seemed like every time I would endorse some feminist, which there are a few exceptions, there was something wrong with her in the community. And she was a TERF. She had said racist things. She had been mean to somebody who is well liked in the community. She'd done this, she'd done that, whatever. And in fact, I was like, I am way more accepting of some schools of feminism than the supposed feminist community is, including especially radical feminism. So, like, there were things that some of these women said that I actually think are perfectly sensible, that people were outraged about. But anyway, I was supposed to exclude these women because the community said, oh, you can't have these women because of this or that. Now, I promised that if anyone, was in my comment section, no matter, how much of a feminist they were and how much I liked what these women were saying about feminism and about their own experiences, like if they said racist things, I'd criticize them. If they said exclusionary things, I would criticize them. But that wasn't good enough for people. And in some cases, these people had, walked back their comments, apologized for them. But I was still supposed to exclude them. And the problem is, it's already a conversation where men are doing most of the talking. So if I exclude any women whatsoever, then that makes the problem even worse. And I just find it extremely hypocritical that there are these men in this community like Kevin Logan who exclude women constantly, talk down to women constantly, or say Dick Coughlin. Here's a tweet from Dick Coughlin about Laci Green, talking down to her. Serial sexual harasser. There is actual proof of this. It just comes from a woman that they don't like on YouTube. Like, Coughlin's like Teflon. Like, nobody actually holds him accountable. But like, these women are excluded because they don't fit into the orthodoxy. It doesn't matter how you behave. It's if you have correct beliefs. So the men in the feminism have figured this out, unconsciously or whether consciously, that they can get away with doing all this shitty stuff. Sexually harassing women, using women, taking the conversation away from women, taking away women's autonomy, and it'll be fine as long as they manage to parrot the correct beliefs in the orthodoxy. And then they're fine. They portray themselves as allies to everybody within the group who is expected you be an ally to. Don't upset the orthodoxy, and then you can get away with whatever you want. So we spent all this time already talking just about the first half of Chrisiousity video. So I'm going to talk about the second half because I didn't watch it right away. What happened was, on Twitter, Laci Green tweets about basically getting doxxed and harassed by someone on Facebook. So someone shared her personal information, and like her and her family had been harassed. Now Chrisiousity tweets it at her. This is what she tweets at her. Now I tweeted at Chrisiousity, and what I tweeted at her was, she doesn't mention a name because Chrisiousity accused her of making a false accusation without evidence. And I said, give your self-righteousness a rest. Because I was already of the opinion, yeah, this is a witch hunt with Laci. And I was a little annoyed with it. But I like Chrisiousity, so I immediately felt guilty after I tweeted that at her. So I decided to watch the rest of her video because I said, well, perhaps the second half of the video has some better idea of why she feels this way.
Laci takes on, unquestioned, the claim that harassment, hate speech, bullying, and other forms of speech are just too difficult to quantify, and we can't do anything about it. And then goes on to say, well, threats are unacceptable. This line is one I often hear, and as far as I'm concerned, that's all it is, a line. Because when the rubber hits the road, it always proves to be worthless. See, the minute you come forward with having been threatened, the skeptic shell game starts, right? They ask you for evidence, and if you do bring evidence for it, it won't be good enough, and it'll only bring more demands for more or different evidence. They analyze the wording of the threat to death and try to play it as not a real threat, and if they can't pull that trick with some weird inversion of language, then they will tell you it's just a troll, it's not serious, and demand you prove it to them otherwise, that it could be serious. Right? Never mind that the only way to prove the seriousness of it is if you get attacked. What are you gonna do? Put it in your will that they pass your autopsy records along? Then they make videos slandering you without evidence, suggesting you're a fraud and a liar and a crybaby and blah blah blah.
So that's the tweet and the what she says in the video side by side. Her tweet couldn't possibly be more ironic based on what's in that video. I just don't know what to say about it. What I'll say is, once again, people don't know about their own biases. I do not really see much of a distinction between how the supposed social justice community or the left of YouTube acts and the right of YouTube acts, and any kind of like moral or ethical distinction a lot of the time. So this brings me to the part of Chrisiousiti's video at the very end that I think has a little teeth to it.
When she asks people on Twitter, why do you think there's only 2 genders? And then posts her map of responses with the superlative interesting on it. Everyone is left to wonder how a public sex educator managed to not encounter all this garbage before dozens of times over. And what the hell is so interesting about it? I got news for you. Prejudice, it's really not all that fascinating.
I looked at what Laci had put there about 2 genders, and nothing on there is something that strikes me as automatically hateful. Even if someone was like, I don't know, like doing one of these about race, I think you could take these arguments about race. Like, say, if someone says race is, like Jerry Coyne, he's a biologist, he like thinks race is real. Not quite to the point that like people we call race realists, which are really just white supremacists, do, but like he has these arguments, and most biologists think it's a useless designation at this point, but he argues otherwise. I don't think his arguments are automatically hateful. I don't think Jerry Coyne is a very bright guy. I don't think he's a very creative thinker, despite being a biologist. Like, I think he's one of those people who's like good with concrete, practical type learning and just doesn't understand abstract thought at all, based on everything I've ever heard him say. Sorry if that's unfair to him, because I haven't read his books or anything like that yet. I've just seen interviews with him. But I don't see why having a discussion about this is automatically off limits. And that what I think is the real problem with the Laci thing and how I see it and how like definitely Captain Andy thinks. Having a discussion about gender is off limits to Captain Andy. I know this because I have a controversial view on gender. Now, it's shared by some people who are non-binary and trans, but that doesn't matter to Captain Andy because it's not the dominant view. Basically, he said, like, what the trans community views gender, that's how what he views it as, which is just like, well, what the majority of people view. Like, it's a appeal to popularity fallacy. But my view is gender nihilism. I think gender nihilism is the only way gender makes sense, and that transgender identity makes sense, that non-binary identity makes sense. Now, I'm willing to debate people on it, and if somebody actually finds that view offensive, I'm willing to talk to them about it. But like, that's the view that makes sense to me, because when I read a lot of trans literature and trans articles, a lot of it doesn't make sense to me. I find they, despite saying that gender and sex are not the same thing, use them interchangeably in ways that are confusing. I find a lot of muddled language. It may just be linguistic problems, that there's just something that our dominant culture sees gender as this binary, and our language has not caught up with it. That could be an explanation for it. But I like find a lot of stuff to unpack and to debate about gender. So having this debate, I don't find automatically offensive. Now, I'm not transgender, so that's my privilege, you could say, to not find it offensive. That's fair enough if you want to make an argument like that. But beyond that, I don't really see what your argument would be, unless you just think we must accept something because the group that it applies to now has this view on it, which incidentally is constantly changing. I understand that certain opinions would upset certain people because they feel they're dehumanizing to them. And I don't know what to do about that. Because the solution is certain topics are off limits even if they could illuminate a better understanding of an issue, or a better understanding of how we think about gender, or any of this stuff. I don't see why Laci talking to anti-feminists is bad, because I understand anti-feminists a lot better after having been on YouTube. I actually have a lot more sympathy for them, which is going to infuriate people right there, that I have more sympathy for them now than I used to, because I understand them better. I still don't agree with them. And I think you gain sympathy for people when you understand what they're talking about. This was the thing about feminism. When I first encountered feminism, I did not understand it. My animosity toward it was built a lot on not understanding it. Once I understood it, then I no longer had the animosity toward it. And then eventually I found, well, yeah, I agree with this stuff. Now, it doesn't mean every time I understand an argument, I'm going to eventually accept it, which is what people would really fear with Laci Green. She's going to understand these people, and then she's going to accept their views. That's not going to necessarily happen, because there's plenty of views I understand that I still reject. A good example is my views on religion. A lot of people don't understand. Like, I studied theology. I know a lot more about it than most atheists who are making arguments against it, which I think are straw man arguments in most cases. So I have more sympathy toward religion because I understand it better than they do. However, I still don't accept it. I think if you're an ally to a group, your responsibilities are to defend that group when they're under attack. That's a responsibility. And not to dominate their discourse, which that one tends to be the hard one. But then, everyone, there's this set of rules that seems to get longer every time I look that people have for being an ally. It ends up becoming a relationship that goes one way. There's plenty of people who are trans, black, Hispanic, gay, white women who I found out this past presidential election think that things like universal health care and $15 minimum wage and free college are pipe dreams, and that despite the fact this would help people disproportionately who are members of this oppressed minority that they claim needs special consideration because of the oppression that they belong to, they think these ideas are ludicrous. That was really enlightening to me because it made me realize how identity politics can be used as a tool of oppression. These things are a little more complicated than we're making them out to be. And the idea that Laci Green is doing something that, like, she owes people is how this is. It's not, it needs to be any relationship you have with somebody needs to be a relationship that goes both ways. If you want them to respect you, you need to respect them. If you want somebody to empathize with you, you need to empathize with them. There are so many people who are members of this supposed social justice community or who are campaigning for their particular group, their particular minority, who literally do not give a shit about anybody who's not part of their group. If it's even worse than that, actually, because there's trans people who work in finance. I know one of them who literally, despite the fact that I told her, your politics are actually bad for trans people, she doesn't care. Despite the fact that she posts stuff constantly on Facebook about trans issues, trans rights, whatever. The fact that she either doesn't understand or doesn't care, the fact that income inequality, like not having universal health care, affects trans people because trans people need support. A lot of them end up homeless as teenagers. Like, all these things affect trans people disproportionately. And I already see with Laci what happened to me. People are taking, I saw this on Facebook, personal messages of her where we don't know what the context is and trying to portray her as excluding them or treating them badly, when the context could be she's had a bad history with this person before and she doesn't want to talk to them because of the bad history. We don't know that. Only Laci knows that. So get out of her shit. That's all I'm saying.
Chrisiousity also brings up the appeal to moderation fallacy, which she claims Laci is using. Noel Plum addresses this. I like his video a lot. There's a lot of things I agree with him on. Most of my disagreements with him would be about terms, the way he's using terms. But in the basic points he's making, I agree at least partially with the point he's making. But in terms of appeal to moderation, like, he points out that false dichotomies are more common on YouTube than appeal to moderation is. And most of the people who accuse people of making appeals to moderations are making false dichotomies. And I would say that is completely true. What Laci is arguing, as far as I can tell, is not an appeal to moderation. It is saying that even if people are bad and have bad views, they should be treated with basic human dignity. They should have an understanding of what you're arguing against and what the people who you're arguing against actually think and where it comes from. And this isn't an appeal to moderation. This is basic standards to me. So the fact that this community thinks that's an appeal to moderation is weird. I find this with logical fallacies. One person on YouTube told me to stop citing logical fallacies. And his point was this community does not understand them. And I said, well, there have been philosophers who argue endlessly over like whether this philosopher at this time committed this fallacy in this argument. So I don't really see how it's any different. He's like, well, you're proving my point for me. But I said, well, yeah, but those are complex philosophical arguments made by some of the great geniuses of the history of philosophy that they're arguing about there. These are YouTube arguments. But if you're trying to convince this audience, like I get accused of logical fallacies all the time, and I'm like, no, that's not this fallacy, and here's why. And I explain to them why exactly it is this fallacy, because informal fallacies are called informal because it's debatable whether it actually applies in each case. So you have to explain why the person appealed to that fallacy in detail if you're going to accuse them of that fallacy. You can't just go, this fallacy, this fallacy, this fallacy, and that's what people do. I was accused of a slippery slope fallacy over arguing with people about punching Nazis, which I'm going to cover in another video. It doesn't deserve its own video at this point. We're past that. But the punching Nazi thing, what I said to this person is, there is no demarcation point when you say, I can preemptively use force and violence against this person because they're bad. And if you say that, then everybody who could possibly be called a Nazi, which people call people Nazis on the internet constantly, people call people Nazis in political arguments constantly, then becomes punchable. It's like, where's your demarcation point? And they accuse me of a slippery slope fallacy. And I was like, it's not a slippery slope fallacy if the actual logical consequences of your view lead to this. It's a slippery slope fallacy to say same-sex marriage leads to marrying animals because there is an actual demarcation you can make between consenting adult humans being able to marry each other and marrying a child or marrying an animal who cannot consent. Those can be made very easily. That's why it's a slippery slope fallacy. There's no demarcation point when it comes to violence against somebody because they're bad. So I was challenging this person to make that claim, and then they just said, well, I'm done talking to you, and left, because that's what happens when you make a point they can't deal with. Arguing with people on the left is no different than arguing with people on the right. They're just as illogical. It's really no different, having done it both ways. The other point Noel Plum makes, which I didn't touch, was like calling Chris Reagan a white supremacist, which I made an argument right after the presidential election, which I don't think people understood, as I said, well, if you nominate two white supremacists, you can't blame people for voting for one white supremacist and not the other. Because if you call Trump a white supremacist, which is actually somewhat debatable, you have to call Hillary Clinton a white supremacist. That was the point I was making. It had nothing to do with what the actual definition of a white supremacist is. Just people were calling Trump a white supremacist. So I was like, well, if Trump is a white supremacist, why isn't Hillary Clinton? And the point I was making is, if you look at the stuff Trump has done in his life and said, and then look at the stuff that Hillary Clinton has done and said that you would call supporting white supremacy or racist, they are almost equivalent. Nobody wanted to engage with the actual argument. Instead, they were like, well, that's insane to call her a white supremacist. By the way, Trump's a white supremacist. I wanted to have that argument. They didn't want to have it. Because it's an actual argument they would lose. So they refused to have it. The left refuses to have any arguments that they will lose. And I was watching the recent Christy Winters hangout where they were talking about Laci Green. And they talk about how these people on YouTube who they consider the enemy won't really debate them in an honest fashion. The left doesn't debate in an honest fashion either. That's one of the points I want to make in the next 3 videos you see. Also, one of the big points that Noel Plum makes in his video is that this is probably hurting Laci a lot and nobody cares, which I bring up earlier in this video about how there's no concern for her. Because when people you thought were your friends suddenly do horrible, horrible things to you, it's really hurtful. As opposed to people who bully you because you have a political difference, which is what most people experience on YouTube.